Sometimes it kind of feels like Japanese watch brands are holding out on the rest of the world, saving some of their best deals for the Japan domestic market. And today we're going to take a look at an amazing chronograph watch from Citizen that has a sapphire crystal, 100 meters of water resistance, and a really cool design to it that you can pick up for around $200 here in Japan. But if you live outside of Japan, it can be much more difficult to track this watch down. Thankfully, the sponsor of today's video, Discovery Japan Mall, opens up the Japanese domestic market to pretty much anybody, regardless of where you live, making it pretty simple for you to get this watch if it's something you're interested in. I'll talk more about them in a minute, but first let's take a quick look at the Citizen CA7030. Hey guys, welcome back to Just the Watch. My name's Dave. I live in Japan and I love to collect affordable watches. And since moving over here to Japan and getting access to the Japanese domestic market, I've been finding just a ton of amazing deals. I often hear people complain about how brands like Citizen and Seiko have been increasing their prices and not giving the specs that people like sapphire crystals. And while that is the general trend that it seems like a lot of watch brands have been going, here in Japan you can still find a lot of watches from these brands that do have those features at extremely reasonable prices. And at the time of filming this video in fall of 2022, the exchange rate between the yen and the dollar is wildly in favor of the dollar, which makes purchasing watches here in Japan, or any product here in Japan, much more affordable. Now, Citizen is one of the best watchmakers in the entire world. When you think of Japanese brands, I think Seiko and Casio tend to have more fervent fans than Citizen does, but Citizen puts out some pretty amazing products. Their bread and butter has got to be the Citizen EcoDrive watches, which are solar-powered watches that are incredibly reliable and accurate, and there's just hundreds of different models out there. I'm a big fan of the technology, but most of the Citizen EcoDrive watches that I see are kind of on the boring side. But as I was searching through the online watch shops here in Japan, this Citizen watch caught my eye both because of the design and the specs that it has in it. Particularly the sapphire crystal and the very striking visual design that I feel like has this kind of retro futuristic look to it. And when I saw the price, I knew it was one I really wanted to pick up to show you guys because that's really what this channel is about, finding great value watches. So let's jump in and talk about the value that this watch offers and the specs that it has, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the design after that. Now, Citizen has a lot of great watches in their affordable EcoDrive line, but one thing that most of these affordable watches don't have is a sapphire crystal. Typically, to get that feature, you have to jump up to some of their more pricey EcoDrive models. But at the time of this review, here in Japan, you can get the CA7030 for under $200. Not only does it feature a sapphire crystal, you also get 100 meters of water resistance, that EcoDrive solar quartz movement, and it has a very nice chronograph feature inside of it. The 12 o'clock subdial keeps track of chronograph minutes up to 60 minutes. The central second hand is used for the chronograph, and when activated, will sweep at 5 times per second, allowing you to time things down to 1/5 of a second. The 6 o'clock subdial contains a sweeping second hand that's tied to the time, and you're also getting a date window at 3 o'clock. And for me, this is just the perfect set of features for a chronograph. So often you see layouts that include something like a 24-hour subdial, or they're lacking a sweeping second hand for the time. This one gives you all of the most useful features you would want on a chronograph watch, and it lays them out in an appealing and interesting fashion with lots of detailed markings that make it possible to read all of the information that you need to on this watch. Price-wise, right now here in Japan, I'm finding it listed for anywhere from around $170 up to $250. And part of the reason why that is such a low price is because the exchange rate is still heavily in favor of the dollar right now. So if you had bought this watch in 2020 when it was released in dollars, the price would have been about 30% higher than it is right now just because of the exchange rate. But as near as I can tell, Citizen has discontinued this watch. I couldn't find it listed on their Japanese website. I did find one colorway listed on their Hong Kong website, so it's kind of in their catalog still to some degree. And I believe the retail price was probably between that $250 and $300 mark when it was initially released. But all that said, it has dropped well below that right now. And at the current prices it's available at, it's a really good value. Now, if you live in Japan, this watch is pretty easy to find right now. I was able to pick mine up on Japanese Amazon. But if you live outside of Japan, it can be a little bit trickier. But thanks to the sponsor of today's video, it doesn't have to be. Discovery Japan Mall is an online marketplace that opens up the Japanese domestic market to pretty much the entire world. They have a pretty staggering array of products that are available only here in Japan. Everything from electronics to toys to books and CDs, but probably the most important and relevant for you is that they also have one of the largest selection of Japanese domestic market watches that I've ever seen. Basically, every JDM watch that I've been able to find here in Japan that I like, that's not available from retailers in the US, I've been able to find it on Discovery Japan Mall. This is now the third video that I've partnered with them for, and I've gotten good feedback from a lot of you guys who have used them to purchase watches, and I feel really comfortable recommending them to you as a place to check out. Now, I've only got 2 colorways in for review, but Discovery Japan Mall has pretty much all the colorways available on their site, some of them for really cheap right now. So whenever you're looking for a JDM watch and trying to find a good place to buy from, I would definitely recommend checking them out and seeing what their prices are on things, because they make it really easy to get your hands on these watches. Now, with that said, let's jump back in and talk a little bit more of the design of the Citizen watch, because there's so many cool little details in here that I really like. I've got 2 different colorways in for review, and well, you might look at it as one being simply a panda and the other being a reverse panda because of the different straps and bracelets that they put on these, and because of the white ring that goes around the outer edge of the dial. These watches really give off kind of different vibes for me. On the panda version with the silver dial, that white ring kind of blends into the dial. It doesn't really stand out that much. And I don't know, for some reason I'm kind of getting these sci-fi vibes coming out of it. The reverse panda, on the other hand, is kitted out with a leather strap and a very dark gray matte dial, which allows that white ring around the dial to have a ton of contrast and really pop out, giving this kind of a tuxedo look. And for me, when you combine all of this visual impact, it sort of gives off kind of these gothic vibes. So I really think you're getting 2 very different personalities depending on the color that you choose here. And it is worth noting that there are a few other colorways floating around. I think I've seen blue, green, and red dials as well. And again, all of those are really going to mix up the personality that this watch has. But regardless of which color you might wind up with, Citizen has really done a great job with the design on this one. The 2 symmetrical vertically aligned subdials have a great look and really stand out in the design. They're sunk into the dial, which means that this watch has a lot of different layers, starting at the bottom with those subdials, jumping up to the main dial, and then up to the applied markers, and then finally out to that raised chapter ring. Really adds a lot of visual interest to the watch as you look at it from different angles. Another key feature of this design is that white ring that goes around the outside of the dial. The color of that ring is a very stark white, which is actually kind of in contrast with the other colors used on these 2 watches, as you're not really getting very sharp, pure blacks and whites anywhere else in the design. The dial on the reverse panda isn't quite black, it's more of a very dark gray, and the subdials aren't quite white, they're a little bit of an off-white. They have kind of a colder, almost pearl-like color. While the Panda dial version gives you a silver sunburst dial, with the subdials being this kind of dark gray that almost has a little bit of a purplish look depending on how the light hits it. Pretty sure these sort of off colors on the subdials is due to the fact that they've hidden the solar cells in the subdials of the watch, and I think they've done a really good job with that. On some of Seiko's solar-powered chronographs I've seen, you can kind of see lines in the subdial. In this one, I can't see any lines, but the colors, again, they're just a little bit off. They're not sharp whites and blacks, and I think that's to allow enough light to get through down to the solar cells underneath them. I also really like the implementation of the tachometer here, just from a visual standpoint. I mean, a tachometer is not something that I ever use, but it's a classic feature of a chronograph, and this one looks really cool with the design they've done. It sits high above the dial on this raised chapter ring. It features very detailed printing with kind of an interesting layout on the numbers. Rather than having the orientation of the printing so that the numbers are always vertically aligned, they kind of wrap around the dial. But to make sure the numbers don't flip upside down on the bottom half of the dial, they've kind of just flipped them at the 3 and 9 o'clock. And this is particularly noticeable at the 3 o'clock position, where you see the tachometer markings go from 250 to 220. It's a little bit quirky, but it keeps things very legible, and again, a very interesting way to lay things out. I also really like the choice of font that they've gone with on all of the markers. It's kind of a bold decision. They didn't just go with a plain safe font. This one definitely has a lot of character, and it's something that's probably going to be a little bit polarizing. And for me, I think that's what gives a lot of these kind of science fiction vibes. It feels like sort of a technical font, particularly when you look at the letter A in tachometer. You can see that the A is just an inverted V. It doesn't have the line going across like normal. It just kind of gives up these like 1960s science fiction retro themed space vibes. and it adds just a little bit of flavor to all of the numbers and markings on the dial. Finally, this watch does have a lot of markings. There are a lot of circles and dashes and lines all over this watch, which give it a very complex look, but also these lines help you to read all of the different functions available to you. The chronograph minutes subdial has individual markings for each minute, larger dashes at every 5 minutes, numerals at every 10, so it's very easy to pick out how many minutes have elapsed. The running sub-seconds hands at 6 likewise has individual markings for each second, larger dashes at 5 seconds, and then numerals at every 15 seconds. And that white ring around the dial has very detailed hash marks, allowing you to read down to 1/5 of a second on the chronograph second hand. And while that does make for an almost dizzying array of markings on the dial that can make it a little bit difficult to read at a glance, I really appreciate the detail that they've implemented here because it allows you to precisely use every single feature of this chronograph. One of my biggest pet peeves are chronographs that lack some of these markings, which can make you have to kind of guess how many minutes or seconds have elapsed, which in my mind pretty much defeats the entire purpose of having a chronograph watch. The whole point of a chronograph is to allow you to make very precise timings, at least down to the individual second, if not down to fractions of a second. And this quartz eco-drive chronograph will allow you to do that, and it also looks really cool. So overall, I think this is a very interesting, cool looking design from Citizen that's also extremely functional. Now, there were a ton of things that I really liked about this watch, but it wasn't a perfect watch. There were a couple things that sort of annoyed me. The finishing, I think, is one of the areas that really could stand to be improved. And I want to talk about the cons of this watch in just a second, but first just a word about the availability of this watch, because I'm not sure how much longer it will be available for, particularly at the price that it is now. Often the best bargains that you can find are on these watches that have been discontinued and are kind of on their way out. Sellers are trying to empty the last stock of them, and that's when you see the prices drop to these crazy low levels. And I love finding these kinds of bargains because that's often when you can find some of the best watches available in this really affordable price range. The obvious drawback is that oftentimes those watches are not going to be available for very long. So all that to say, if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, I definitely encourage you to do so. That way, as soon as I release a video talking about these kinds of watches, you'll have the chance to purchase them before they disappear. But before you decide whether or not you want to purchase this watch, there's a few negatives that we need to talk about. There are 3 things that I wasn't particularly impressed with on this watch. The first of which was the overall finishing. Now, it's certainly not bad finishing, especially for the price that these are available for right now. The case does feature a mixture of brushed and polished surfaces with some polishing done along the bevels on the lugs. However, the definition between the brushed and polished areas is just not that sharp. Likewise, the handset also has some noticeably rough edges. And finally, that white ring upon which they have printed the detailed second and fifths of a second markings kind of looks like it's just a decal stuck on there. It's most likely painted on, and it does allow for those detailed markings to stand out very clearly on the dial and to make them very legible, so I appreciate that aspect of it. But I think it kind of cheapens the look of what's otherwise a pretty excellent dial. The second thing that disappointed me was the lume on this watch. Now, this watch does feature lume on the hands and on the markers, which is appreciated. However, this is not sports watch level lume. This is more dress watch level lume. It fades very quickly, and you're probably not going to get more than 15 minutes of legibility out of it, even after it's been fully charged by sunlight. And Citizen is capable of putting some powerful lume on their watches. I've seen it done, but on this one, it seems like they cut some corners and just left it with a sort of weak green glow. And the final issue is that at-a-glance legibility is not the greatest on this watch. Well, they did a great job with the markings, allowing you to read the time on the chronograph very precisely. The handset is a little bit on the thin side and can easily get lost among all of the details that are present on the dial. This is especially true for the very thin white chronograph second hand, and perhaps the most difficult part of this watch to read is the date at 3 o'clock. It's sunk very deeply into the dial, which is a consequence of having that solar powered movement. You've got an extra layer of solar panels in the design, so the date has to be kind of sunk down pretty far. And unfortunately, that means it's going to get a lot of shadows cast on it, and it's not particularly large either, so it's, just generally difficult to see. Alright guys, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you think of this particular watch. Let me know what you think of JDM watches in general, if this is the kind of thing you want to continue seeing. And if you're still on the fence about this particular watch and want to get a second opinion, make sure you check out Alton's review over at Half Past Blog. He's also one of the few watch channels that I know that's done a review of this watch. Leave a link to his video down in the description. Finally, if you're interested in getting a t-shirt like this one, long sleeve or hoodie, you can pick these up at my website at justthewatch.com. That will wrap it up for today. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.